McKeesport, Pennsylvania, a quiet riverside town where neighbors knew each other by name, and life moved at an easy, familiar pace. But on a cold February afternoon in 1996, that calm was broken when a 14-year-old girl walked out of Cornell Middle School and never came home. In a place where nothing ever truly changed, one disappearance would haunt the town for a decade, raising a question no one could answer. How does someone vanish in broad daylight, just streets from her own home? The old steel mills still stood along the river, but most of them were silent now, their chimneys cold. Mornings smelled of wet pavement and coffee from the corner diner, and by afternoon the air carried the echo of the school bell from Cornell Middle School. People still left their doors unlocked. They believed bad things happened somewhere else. Tanya Koch was 14 years old, shy and thoughtful, a child who never stayed out late and never forgot to call her father after school. Her teachers liked her for her manners, her neighbors for her gentle way of speaking. She lived with her father, Larry, a quiet man who worked long hours at the local machine shop. He raised her alone after the divorce, and though their house was small, it was filled with small routines that felt like safety. Dinner at 6, homework at the kitchen table, the porch light left on every night until she was asleep. That Friday morning, February 10th, began like any other. The air was still cold, the trees bare, and the sidewalks slick with melting snow. Tanya left the house at 7:45, her blue sweater buttoned to the neck, her backpack slung over one shoulder. Larry handed her $1 for lunch and said, "See you after school, kiddo." She smiled, a small, quick smile, and then she was gone. At Cornell Middle School, the day passed without notice. Tanya attended all her classes. Her English teacher later recalled she seemed distracted but not upset, doodling small stars in the margins of her notebook. During lunch, she sat with 2 friends and talked about a math quiz scheduled for next week. When the final bell rang at 3:15, students flooded out of the building, laughing, pushing, shouting across the parking lot. Most went toward the front gate where the buses waited, but one girl remembered seeing Tanya walking toward the back of the school, near the gym, as if she meant to take a shortcut home. She was alone. That was the last confirmed sighting. By 4:30, Larry was finishing his shift at the shop. He cleaned the oil from his hands, glanced at the clock, and thought of his daughter walking home through the chill. By habit, she arrived around 3:45. When he got home just before 5, the house was quiet. The television was off, the light in her room dim. Her coat was gone, but her school books weren't on the table. He waited, assuming she might have stopped at a friend's house. But as the hour passed, unease began to settle in his chest. At 6:30, he started calling, her friends. Each one gave the same answer. They hadn't seen her after class. By 7, Larry's voice was tight with worry. He drove his old pickup along her route home, checking the sidewalks, the corner store, the park by the river. There was no sign of her. He circled the blocks near the school twice, then stopped outside the gym parking lot where the snow had turned to slush. The area was empty, just the yellow light of a street lamp flickering on the wet pavement. By 8 o'clock, panic had replaced reason. Larry returned home and called the McKeesport Police Department. The officer who answered asked the usual questions. How old? What was she wearing? Had she ever run away before? Larry said no. She was too careful, too timid. She didn't even like walking alone after dark. The officer told him a patrol car would stop by. At 9, Officer Dale Thompson arrived. He was young, polite, and cautious in tone. Sitting in the small living room, he flipped open a notepad. "You're sure there wasn't an argument recently?" Larry shook his head. "No, she was fine this morning. She was just going to school." The officer nodded slowly, writing each detail: the blue sweater, the brown hair, the direction she usually walked. "It's possible she's with friends," he said carefully. "Kids sometimes stay overnight without telling anyone." Larry's answer was quiet but firm. "Not Tanya. She always comes home." By 10:30, a missing child bulletin was issued to patrol units. Officers checked the nearby bus stops, the train platform, the small diner near the bridge. Nothing. The night had turned colder, the streets glazed with frost. Larry stood by the front window, watching each pair of headlights that turned down the street, praying one of them would stop in front of the house. None did. Around midnight, he drove back to the school himself. The building loomed dark and still. He parked near the back lot and walked the short path that led toward the gym, shining a flashlight along the fence. The snow there was marked with a few footprints, but they were old, half-melted. He called her name once, softly, "Tanya," as if she might somehow answer. Only the wind replied. At 2 a.m, he returned home. The porch light was still burning. He left it on, unable to switch it off. He sat in the kitchen, the phone beside him, his hands clasped together. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Every few minutes, he looked toward the door. By dawn, the police had organized a small search team. Officers retraced her usual route to school, questioning early commuters, store clerks, anyone who might have seen her. No one had. They checked along the riverbank and near the playground, but the ground was undisturbed. The principal confirmed that Tanya had attended every class that day and left with the other students. There were no signs of a fight, no missing items from her locker. Everything was ordinary except for her absence. Later that morning, a larger search was requested. Flyers were printed with her photograph, her name in bold letters across the top. Larry helped staple them to telephone poles until his fingers went numb from the cold. Neighbors came out to help, their faces tight with worry. Reporters appeared, snapping pictures, asking for statements, but Larry couldn't bring himself to speak. By the end of that first day, more than 30 volunteers had joined the search. They walked the wooded trails behind the school, the vacant lots, the narrow paths along the old rail line. Police dogs followed scent traces that ended abruptly near the back parking fence. Beyond that, nothing. It was as if Tanya had stepped off the face of the earth. When the sun set again, the searchers returned one by one, their flashlights dimming in the distance. Larry stood by the curb as the last patrol car drove away, the noise fading until the night was still again. He looked at the house glowing faintly in the dark, the porch light burning like a beacon, and whispered to himself, "She'll come home. She has to." At that point, no one knew that Tanya Koch had truly vanished. The police called it a developing situation, and the neighbors promised to keep watch. But somewhere between that Friday afternoon and the first light of Saturday morning, a quiet town lost a child. And in the span of a single day, McKeesport's peace, steady and familiar, was broken in a way it would never quite recover. The morning after Tanya's disappearance, McKeesport woke under a pale gray sky. Patrol cars moved slowly along Walnut Street, their headlights cutting through the mist that hovered over the river. Police officers, joined by local volunteers, began a systematic search. They started near Cornell Middle School, combing the wooded edges of the playground, the riverbank of the Monongahela, and the narrow alleys that wound behind the old industrial buildings. The ground was soft from melting snow, the air heavy with silence. Every few minutes, someone called her name, "Tanya," and then waited, listening for an answer that never came. By mid-morning, the command post had been set up in the school's parking lot. Maps were spread across the hood of a police car, coffee steamed in paper cups, and clipboards filled with notes that all said the same thing. No sign, No sound, no clue. The dogs followed scent for a few yards, and then lost it near the gym's back gate. The footprints found there could have belonged to anyone. Nothing pointed to where she had gone or who she might have met. For a child to disappear so completely, so quickly, felt impossible. Detective Ronald Gates, the officer assigned to the case, held a short press conference that afternoon. He spoke carefully, his words measured. At this time, there is no indication of foul play. We are exploring all possibilities. When reporters asked whether Tanya could have run away, he did not say no. "We have to keep an open mind," he said, though his tone suggested the investigation was already leaning in that direction. The town's reaction split almost immediately. Some people believed what Larry Cash refused to, that Tanya had chosen to leave, that she might have argued with her father or fallen in with older friends. Others were certain something darker had happened. Rumors began to circle the school hallways. A stranger's car parked near the gym. A man seen walking behind her that week. A phone call no one could confirm. But none of these details held up under questioning. The police found no evidence of a struggle, no sign of force, not even a misplaced piece of clothing. At the Koch home, reporters knocked until late that evening. Larry stood at the door, his face drawn and sleepless. "My daughter didn't run away," he said firmly. "Someone has her." The next day, his words were quoted in the local newspaper beneath her photograph, the headline reading, "Father insists daughter was taken." The story drew sympathy, but also skepticism. In a small town, people talked more than they should, and soon everyone had a version of the story that fit their own idea of what might have happened. Meanwhile, the search expanded. Firefighters and volunteers walked the frozen river's edge in long lines, shoulder to shoulder. Divers went into the shallow sections where ice had thinned, their faces grim as they surfaced with nothing to report. Officers checked empty houses, drainage tunnels, and the wooded lot behind the mill. But each lead ended in silence. Helicopters from Pittsburgh circled overhead for 2 days, scanning for clothing or movement before being called back. The scale of the effort was immense, but it brought them no closer to finding the girl. By the end of the first week, exhaustion began to set in. Larry spent his days at the police station, reviewing the same notes, the same maps, pleading for them to keep looking. At night, he drove the route between his home and the school again and again, the radio turned low, the passenger seat empty. Neighbors left casseroles at his door, unsure what else to do. The lights in his house stayed on long after midnight, a faint glow visible from the street. Within a month, the search area had grown wider, but the attention smaller. The television crews left, and the newspaper articles became shorter. New crimes, new accidents filled the evening news. Tanya's case began to slip quietly from the headlines. Only her father's persistence kept it from being forgotten entirely. He wrote letters to every police department in the state, every news station, every missing children's network. Some answered with sympathy, others with form letters. None brought new information. The detectives continued their work, but the tone changed. Files labeled "runaway" were always treated differently, less urgent, less visible. One officer admitted years later that they had hoped she would simply walk back through the door on her own, as so many teenagers did. But Larry knew better. He said it in every interview. "She's not out there because she wants to be. Someone talked her into leaving." His words rarely made the evening news, but they were written into every report. By April, flyers with Tanya's face had begun to fade. Rain had blurred the ink, the edges curled on telephone poles. The posters still flapped in the wind near the post office, near the grocery store, near the school gates, as if refusing to be forgotten. Her classmates brought flowers to the steps of the gym, tying ribbons around the railings. The school counselor kept a photo of her on the bulletin board in the hallway, next to the slogan, "If you see something, say something." It stayed there for years. 3 months after she vanished, the McKeesport Police Department filed an internal update. The report stated, "No confirmed sightings. Investigation ongoing. Possible runaway." It was the kind of bureaucratic language that signaled the beginning of silence. The case would remain open, but only on paper. At home, Larry refused to move on. He called missing children hotlines every night, giving the same details, his voice steady but growing thinner each time. Sometimes he drove to nearby towns, when someone reported a girl who looked like Tanya. Each time, he returned alone, his truck covered in dust, the seat beside him empty. "She's out there," he told anyone who asked. "She didn't just disappear." Summer came, and with it a restless heat that seemed to press down on the whole town. The river ran slow, the air thick with humidity, and McKeesport tried to return to its quiet rhythm. But for those who had searched, something had shifted. Parents walked their children to school now. Doors that once stayed unlocked were bolted shut. The town had learned how quickly the familiar could turn strange. By the end of 6 months, the police files were boxed and archived. The label read, "Runaway Juvenile, Possible Voluntary Departure." Larry stared at the words when they showed him the paperwork. "Voluntary," he repeated under his breath, as if the word itself was an accusation. He folded the copy and tucked it into his jacket pocket. That night, he went home, turned on the porch light, and stood there for a long time, watching the quiet street. The hum of crickets filled the air, and from somewhere far away came the sound of a train. Inside the house, Tanya's room was still untouched, the books on the shelf, the small radio by her bed, the sweater draped over her chair. Larry sat in the doorway, the glow from the hallway spilling across the floorboards, and whispered her name once before turning off the light. Outside, the posters on the telephone poles flapped weakly in the summer breeze, their colors fading but their message the same. After half a year, all that remained of the search were those tattered sheets of paper, and a father's prayer whispered into the stillness each night. McKeesport carried on, but something in its heartbeat had changed. The town no longer trusted quietness. It knew now how easily it could hide a tragedy. Time moved differently after Tanya disappeared. The first months had been filled with sirens, searches, and headlines, but by the start of 1997, the noise had faded into a long, heavy quiet. The posters that once lined Main Street had peeled away under the winter rain, leaving behind faint rectangles of tape on the poles. The case that had once shaken McKeesport was now just one folder in a filing cabinet at the police station. Thin, worn, and gathering dust. The original investigator retired that spring. His replacement, a younger detective named Carl Benson, was polite when he first called Larry to introduce himself. "We're keeping her file open," he said, "but right now we don't have new leads." Larry thanked him, though he had heard those same words too many times. The officer's tone was respectful but distant, like a man speaking about something that had already slipped out of reach. The department changed hands again 2 years later, and Tanya's case was moved from one desk to another. Each new detective skimmed the notes, circled the same 2 words, "No evidence," and signed their initials at the bottom of the last report. Somewhere along the way, the case number was rewritten in pencil, faded, and filed under runaway juvenile. It wasn't that the police had stopped caring. They simply had nowhere else to look. Every February 10th, Larry still called the McKeesport Police Department. He always asked for the officer in charge of missing persons, though the name changed every few years. The conversations were short. "Any news?" he would ask. The answer was always the same. "Nothing new, sir, but we'll keep her on the active list." After hanging up, he would sit in the quiet of his kitchen, staring at her photograph on the wall. A girl frozen in time, still 14, still smiling. Each year, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children sent out updated posters with age progression sketches. They showed what Tanya might look like at 16, then 18, then 20. Larry pinned every one of them to the refrigerator, though each new drawing felt more like a stranger than a daughter. He mailed copies to post offices and rest stops across Pennsylvania, scrawling, "Please call if seen," beneath his phone number. He never changed that number, afraid she might one day try to reach him. The town around him kept moving forward. New houses went up near the river. The old mill closed for good. People who had once joined the search now had children of their own in high school. For them, Tanya's name had become part of a distant memory, a story told quietly when warning kids to stay safe. The only visible reminder was a small framed photograph on the counter of the local diner. The owner, who'd known Larry for years, refused to take it down. "She's still one of ours," she'd say whenever someone asked. From time to time, small flickers of hope surfaced, false sightings that never led anywhere. In 1998, a woman in Pittsburgh reported seeing a girl who looked like Tanya at a bus terminal. Larry drove there the same night, searching through waiting areas and asking strangers for help. The girl turned out to be someone else, a runaway from another town. In 2000, another call came from Ohio. A waitress thought she recognized Tanya's face from an old missing poster. Police followed up, but again, it was nothing. Each lead raised hope, and each failure left a deeper ache behind. Through the years, Larry held on to routine as though it were the only way to stay sane. Every Sunday, he washed his truck, vacuumed the seats, and folded a blanket on the passenger side. "In case she ever needs a ride home," he once told a neighbor. On her birthday each October, he lit a candle by the window and left it burning overnight. He never spoke about what he wished for, but those who knew him said that on those nights, he didn't sleep. The house itself began to carry the weight of her absence. Her bedroom stayed exactly as it had been the morning she left. The pale curtains, the stuffed bear on her bed, the cassette player on the nightstand. Dust gathered, but Larry couldn't bring himself to disturb anything. "If she comes back," he once told a family friend, "I want her to find it just like she left it." The missing person flyers eventually stopped arriving by mail, replaced by automated updates on national databases. Still, once a year, Tanya's picture appeared briefly on the local news, part of a montage of missing children broadcast each May. Her image flashed across the screen for 2 seconds, her name spoken softly by a news anchor before the segment ended. Most viewers didn't notice. But somewhere in McKeesport, a father always did. He would stop whatever he was doing, look up, and whisper, "That's my girl." By 2003, the case file had not been opened in nearly 2 years. The department's resources were thin. Newer cases took priority. The folder containing Tanya's name was moved to long-term storage, sealed in a cardboard box along with other unsolved files. Inside were a handful of photographs, interview notes, and the original missing person report written in the officer's hurried handwriting. The last line read simply, "No further action recommended until new information arises." For most of McKeesport, Tanya's name had faded into the background of memory. People mentioned her occasionally, in passing, when recalling the worst things the town had seen. "Remember that girl from Cornell School?" someone might say at the grocery store, and another would nod, unsure of the details. Life went on. The river kept flowing. Children still walked to school, and the sky over the mills turned the same shade of orange every evening. But for one man on Walnut Street, time never moved forward. Larry Koch grew older in the shadow of that silence. His hair turned gray, his posture stooped, but his habits never changed. He still kept her room neat, still checked the mailbox for letters that never came, still called the police once a year without fail. On his kitchen wall hung a small calendar where he marked the date of every call, every anniversary, every unreturned message. It was his way of keeping her story alive in a world that had long stopped listening. By the start of 2006, 10 years had passed since Tanya's disappearance. The neighbors no longer asked questions, and the police no longer offered updates. Yet on quiet nights, when the wind came off the river and rattled the windows, Larry swore he could still hear her footsteps on the porch. The memory of a sound he could never let go of. McKeesport had learned to live with the emptiness she left behind. The town no longer searched, but it hadn't forgotten. Her face remained etched somewhere between memory and myth, a reminder of how something so ordinary, so familiar could vanish without warning. And so the years turned, quiet and unrelenting. The posters had faded, the voices had gone silent, but in one small house with a porch light that never went out, a father kept waiting. McKeesport had learned to live with absence, but it had never truly learned how to forget. By March of 2006, McKeesport had settled into a quiet familiarity again. The years had smoothed over old wounds, at least on the surface. The mills were gone, but the town still moved at the same slow pace. On Union Avenue, just a few blocks from the old Cornell Middle School, there stood a small grocery store with a faded red awning. It was the kind of place that sold everything: milk, canned goods, newspapers, and cigarettes. And its owner, Joe Sparico, was the kind of man everyone in the neighborhood trusted. Joe was 58 that spring, with thinning gray hair and a habit of humming softly while stacking the shelves. He had been running the store for more than 20 years, and he knew every regular by face and by rhythm, who came for bread in the mornings, who bought the lottery tickets after work, who always asked for the same brand of coffee. That was why, when a young woman began coming in every few days, her presence caught his attention. She never stayed long, never said much, and always seemed to glance at the door as though making sure no one followed her. She said her name was Nikki Allen. She was thin, pale, her dark blonde hair tied back loosely, and her clothes were plain but clean. She usually bought small things: bread, instant soup, shampoo, and paid in cash. Joe noticed that she spoke carefully, as if measuring each word, and that her hands trembled when she handed him money. At first, he thought little of it. The neighborhood saw its share of people trying to make a quiet life after hard times. But something about her eyes unsettled him. There was a kind of fear behind them, like someone who had learned not to trust the world. Over the weeks, Joe began to notice small details. Nikki never came with anyone, but she always looked toward the street corner before crossing. Sometimes, a man would stand near the far end of the block, waiting. He never entered the store, only lingered by the lamppost, smoking. When Nikki left, she would walk toward him, head down, her steps quick. Joe figured he must be her father, or maybe a boyfriend, but there was something wrong in the way she avoided meeting his eyes. Then, one afternoon near the end of March, she came in later than usual. The store was nearly empty. Joe was restocking shelves when he heard her voice behind him. "Mr. Sparico?" she said quietly. He turned and saw her standing by the counter, clutching a small carton of milk. Her face looked paler than before, her expression tight with hesitation. "Can I ask you something?" she whispered. "Of course," Joe said gently. She glanced toward the window, then back at him. Her voice shook when she spoke. If someone had been missing for a long time, and they wanted to come back, Do you think people would still believe them? Joe froze. The question seemed to hang in the air between them. He could see her breathing fast, her hands gripping the counter for balance. I think, he said carefully, that if someone was missing, people would never stop wanting them back, no matter how long it's been. She nodded quickly, her eyes filling with tears she tried to hide. Thank you, she murmured, and then, without another word, she hurried out of the store. Joe watched her cross the street, the man waiting in the distance. He reached out as if to grab her arm, then simply turned and walked beside her down the block until they disappeared around the corner. That night, Joe couldn't shake the conversation from his mind. He sat at his kitchen table long after closing, the glow of the small computer monitor flickering across his face. The question she had asked kept repeating itself. If someone had been missing for a long time. He opened his web browser and searched Missing Children, Pennsylvania. The first results came from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. He scrolled through the faces, young, smiling, frozen in time. Then he stopped. The photo was old, slightly grainy, but the resemblance hit him like a jolt. Tanya Nicole Koch, missing since 1996, McKeesport, Pennsylvania. She would have been 14 then, 24 now. Joe stared at the image for a long time. The same eyes, the same slight curve of the mouth, though softer, older. He leaned back in his chair, his pulse quickening. Dear God, he whispered. The next morning, Joe walked into the McKeesport Police Department. The desk sergeant recognized him. Everyone knew Joe. What can I do for you, Mr. Sparico? The officer asked. Joe placed a printed copy of the missing child's poster on the counter. His voice was steady but low. I think I've seen her, he said. I think that girl, Tanya Koch, is living right here in town. She goes by another name now, Nikki Allen. Within hours, the department reopened the old file. The name Koch, Tanya Nicole, was pulled from the archive cabinet, the yellowing pages spread out under fluorescent light. The same detective who had once signed off on the runaway report stood silent as new officers began cross-checking records. The department confirmed the location Joe had given them. A small house on East 9th Avenue, just a mile and a half from the school where Tanya had last been seen 10 years earlier. The detail sent a chill through the station. For a decade, she had been missing, and yet she had never truly left. She had been living in the same town, hidden in plain sight. Detective Benson, now leading the renewed investigation, ordered a discreet verification. Plainclothes officers visited the store and confirmed Joe's account. They obtained the address from utility records and planned to approach cautiously without alerting the man she lived with. The information Joe provided was clear. Nikki Allen, mid-20s, residing with a middle-aged man who claimed she was his girlfriend. That night, Joe sat in his empty store long after closing, the shelves dark except for the light above the counter. He couldn't stop picturing her face, the fragile calm, the unspoken fear. For 10 years, her picture had been printed on flyers, shown on TV, tucked away in filing cabinets. And somehow, by chance, she had walked into his shop. At the police station, the revived case drew quiet urgency. Photos were compared, records reviewed, and the officers prepared to act. Detective Benson said it out loud, almost in disbelief. If this is really her, we might be looking at the end of one of the longest missing child cases in Pennsylvania history. McKeesport had not heard Tanya Koch's name in years, but before the week was over, it would be spoken again. In police briefings, in newsroom whispers, and in one small store on Union Avenue, where a man who had once minded his own business would become the unlikely thread that pulled a long-lost child back into the world. That night, as the wind swept through the quiet streets and the porch lights flickered across the old houses, The town itself seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere behind one of those closed doors, a frightened young woman waited, unaware that the truth she had hidden for 10 long years was finally beginning to surface. On the evening of March 21st, 2006, McKeesport's air carried a sharp chill. The neighborhood around East 9th Avenue was quiet, just the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog echoing through the narrow streets. Inside a weathered 2-story house at the end of the block, a young woman sat by a bedroom window, staring out through a crack in the curtain. To anyone passing by, she might have seemed like a tenant keeping to herself. But for Tanya Koch, known to her captor as Nikki Allen, this night felt different. Somewhere deep inside her, after 10 years of silence, something had shifted. For weeks, Tanya had been trying to gather the courage to do what she was about to do. The words she had spoken to Joe Sparico in the store had been her first cry for help, the first risk she had taken in a decade. She hadn't planned to say anything. The question had simply slipped out, trembling and half-whispered. But when Joe looked at her, not with suspicion, not with judgment, but with genuine concern, something in her heart had cracked open. And now, after years of fear and obedience, she was ready to take a step toward freedom. Thomas Hose, the man she lived with, was downstairs, watching television. His routines were as predictable as the passing days. Dinner at 7, the local news at 8, the same recliner, the same beer bottle on the side table. Tanya had learned long ago how to move quietly, how to avoid his attention. For the first 4 years, she hadn't been allowed to leave the house at all, confined to an upstairs bedroom with a bucket and a single small lamp. Later, after he told his parents she was his girlfriend, she had been permitted to step outside occasionally, but only under his watch, only with his permission. Freedom, when it finally came in small pieces, had never really been hers. That night, after Jose went to bed, Tanya sat awake. The walls of the room seemed to hum with old memories. The days when she was still a child. The first time he'd told her she couldn't go home. The nights when she'd listened for the sound of her father's voice outside. She didn't know if her father was still alive, or if anyone remembered her. But she remembered the light in Joe's eyes when she'd asked that question in the store, the certainty in his voice when he said people never stop believing. She held on to that sentence like a rope. At around 9:30, Tanya slipped on her coat and stepped quietly down the stairs. The house was still, the television dark. Jose's snores came faintly from the next room. She paused at the door, hand trembling over the handle, and for a long moment she couldn't move. 10 years of fear and control had taught her that the outside world wasn't safe, that every attempt to leave would end in punishment. But something in her had begun to believe differently. She opened the door. The night air hit her face like a shock. For a moment she simply stood there, breathing it in. Then she began to walk. She made her way down the block to the corner store. The streets were empty, but she moved quickly, clutching the strap of her bag. When she reached the shop, the lights were still on. Joe was sweeping the floor, getting ready to close. He looked up when the bell above the door jingled and froze. She was shaking. Her eyes darted to the window, then back to him. "Mr. Sparico," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's me. My name isn't Nikki. It's Tanya." For a second, he just stared, unsure whether he had heard correctly. Then he set down the broom. "Tanya?" he said softly. She nodded, tears spilling down her face. "I need help," she whispered. "Please. I need to go home." Joe moved quickly but calmly. He locked the front door and led her to the small office at the back of the store. "You're safe here," he said. "Just stay here with me." He picked up the phone and called the McKeesport Police Department. His voice was steady but urgent. "This is Joe Sparico," he said. "You need to send someone right now. I think I have the girl who went missing 10 years ago, Tanya Koch. She's alive." Within 15 minutes, 2 patrol cars pulled up outside the store, their lights flashing softly in the dark. Officers entered quietly, speaking in low voices. Tanya sat in the back room, clutching a cup of water, her hands trembling. She looked fragile, pale, her face thin, but her eyes alert. When the officers asked for her name, she spoke it aloud for the first time in years. "Tanya Nicole Koch," she said. "I used to live on Walnut Street." The officers exchanged glances. They knew the name. Every cop in McKeesport had heard it at some point in their career. A ghost case, a file that had sat untouched in storage for nearly a decade. Now the ghost was sitting right in front of them. One of the detectives gently asked her where she had been. She hesitated, glancing toward the window, then answered quietly, "I've been here, in town. I lived with a man named Tom Hose. He used to work at my school." Her voice cracked on the last word. Within an hour, the police were at Hose's house. They found him in his chair, half asleep, unaware of what was coming. When the officers knocked, he tried to act confused. "What's this about?" he asked. But the moment they said Tanya's name, his face drained of color. The arrest was calm, efficient, but the tension in the air was sharp enough to cut through. News of the rescue spread through the department before dawn. Officers who had been there in 1996 stopped by the station in disbelief. "We thought she was gone," one said quietly. "All these years." When Larry Koch received the call just after sunrise, he couldn't speak. The dispatcher repeated the words twice before he understood. "Your daughter's been found. She's alive." For a long time, he said nothing. Then simply whispered, "Where?" That morning, when father and daughter finally stood face to face again at the police station, the air seemed to stop moving. Tanya was trembling as she stepped forward. Larry's hands shook as he reached out, afraid she might vanish again if he blinked. And then she was in his arms, the sound of his voice breaking the silence that had lived between them for a decade. "You're home now," he whispered. "You're safe." Outside, the press began to gather, drawn by the miracle they could barely believe. But inside the small-town station, away from the cameras, the reunion was quiet. 2 people holding on to each other after 10 years of unanswered prayers. That night, as McKeesport slept, the porch light on Walnut Street burned again. This time it wasn't a signal for hope. It was a symbol that hope had finally come home. The news spread through McKeesport before morning broke fully over the river. A girl missing for 10 years, found alive just a mile and a half from where she vanished. People woke to the sound of radio broadcasters repeating the same impossible sentence: "Tanya Koch has been found." In diners and gas stations, the name stirred old memories of posters that had once hung on walls, of candlelight vigils that had long since stopped. By noon, television crews lined up outside the police station, their cameras trained on the same small entrance where, inside, a young woman sat wrapped in a borrowed blanket, speaking softly to detectives. The first hours were quiet but heavy. Tanya answered their questions carefully, her voice low, her words measured, like someone learning to speak again. She told them about the years she spent locked in a small upstairs room, about the first time she tried to ask to go home, and how he'd silenced her with threats and false promises. She described the bucket she had to use, the thin mattress, the way he'd told her that the world had forgotten her, that even her father had stopped looking. The officers listening took notes in silence. Some of them had children of their own, and their faces grew hard as they wrote. When the questioning ended, a nurse was brought in. Tanya weighed less than 90 pounds. Her skin was pale, her frame fragile, but her eyes, though tired, held something unbroken. She asked for her father. Larry entered the room slowly, as if afraid she might disappear if he moved too fast. The years had carved deep lines in his face, but when she looked up, he saw his daughter. Not the time that had passed. He didn't ask questions. He just held her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of his breathing and her quiet sobs filled the room. When she finally found words, they were simple. I wanted to come home. Outside, reporters swarmed the station steps. The story had already traveled beyond Pennsylvania. Headlines called her the girl next door who was never gone. News vans idled for hours, waiting for a glimpse of her face. But Tanya was kept out of sight. The police knew the case was more than a miracle. It was also a crime scene that stretched back a decade. At 10 that morning, officers executed a search warrant at the home of Thomas Hose. The small 2-story house looked ordinary from the outside. White paint, trimmed hedges, a worn mailbox. But inside, investigators found a world that had been carefully constructed to keep one person hidden. The upstairs bedroom was sparse and windowless, with old bedding, a single lamp, and a locked door that opened only from the outside. A worn bucket sat in one corner. The wallpaper was peeling, the air heavy with dust. Everything she had described matched exactly. Jose was taken to the Allegheny County Jail that afternoon. During questioning, he sat expressionless, his eyes dull. When asked why he had done it, he gave no answer. At times he muttered about protecting her, about how she chose to stay. The detectives exchanged glances. They had seen delusion before, but rarely one so practiced. He didn't ask for a lawyer until the next morning, when the full list of charges was read to him. Involuntary deviant sexual intercourse, aggravated indecent assault, statutory sexual assault, corruption of a minor, interference with custody, and child endangerment. In McKeesport, the community's reaction was mixed with disbelief and guilt. People asked each other the same questions over and over. How could she have been there all along? How did no one see her? Jose had been a school security guard. Trusted, polite, always smiling at parents during pickup hours. He had lived with his elderly parents and his son, and somehow had managed to keep Tanya hidden for years beneath their roof. When she was finally allowed to come downstairs years later, he introduced her as Nikki, my girlfriend. No one questioned it. It was, perhaps, the most painful truth of all, that an entire neighborhood had lived beside a captive and never known. For the police, the next few weeks were consumed with reconstructing the timeline. Records from the school were reviewed, witnesses re-interviewed, old notes compared with Tanya's new testimony. Every detail fit together like a puzzle that had been waiting for one missing piece. Even the report from 1996, the one marked runaway juvenile, became evidence of how easily assumptions can bury the truth. The media called it a miracle. For Larry, it was something quieter, a mixture of joy, grief, and disbelief all tangled together. He brought Tanya home 2 days after she was released from the hospital. The porch light that had burned for 10 years was still there. When she stepped through the doorway, her breath caught. Everything was the same. The worn couch, the framed photographs, the small radio by the window. Her room looked exactly as she had left it, though the air carried a faint smell of dust and time. She stood by the doorway for a long moment before whispering, "It feels smaller than I remember." Larry smiled faintly. "You just got taller," he said. though both knew that wasn't true. For weeks, she stayed mostly inside, avoiding reporters, speaking only to investigators and the counselor assigned to her case. The house became a place of recovery, a space where she tried to learn ordinary things again. How to walk to the store without fear. How to sleep through the night without locking the door. The neighbors brought flowers and food. People who had once whispered about the runaway girl now came to apologize, their eyes full of shame. Tanya thanked them softly but rarely spoke. Healing, she learned, was quieter than anyone expected. As the case against Jose moved toward court, more details emerged. He had kept journals, meticulous notes of daily routines, his attempts to justify what he had done. To read them was to see the pattern of manipulation, the calculated control, the way he had convinced her she had nowhere else to go. Prosecutors called it one of the most severe cases of grooming and psychological confinement they had ever handled. When the day of his arraignment came, the courtroom was full. Larry sat in the first row, his hands folded tightly. Tanya was not present. She chose to stay home. But her statement was read aloud, a simple declaration of fact and endurance. "I was alive all this time," she had written. "He took 10 years from me, but he didn't take who I am." As the judge read the charges, Jose stared at the floor. He said nothing, not even when asked to enter a plea. His lawyer did it for him. Guilty. The courtroom exhaled in a low murmur. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions at Larry, but he said little. "Justice isn't joy," he told one. "It's just the truth being written down." That night, back home on Walnut Street, he and Tanya sat together on the porch. The air smelled faintly of rain. The porch light glowed as it always had. For the first time in a decade, it didn't feel like a beacon waiting for someone. It was just a light, a simple, steady thing. Inside on the kitchen wall, the old calendar still hung. Larry took down the page marked February 1996, folded it carefully, and tucked it away in a drawer. "We don't need to mark time anymore," he said quietly. Tanya nodded, her eyes on the light outside. After 10 years of waiting, the town of McKeesport had its answer. But the truth, like most truths, did not come with celebration. It came quietly, carried in the steady heartbeat of those who had refused to stop believing. By the summer of 2007, the courthouse in Allegheny County had become a gathering place for cameras and whispered outrage. The headlines called it the McKeesport Miracle. But in the courtroom, the story was stripped of wonder. There were no miracles, only facts, evidence, and the slow, steady language of justice. After months of hearings and psychiatric evaluations, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania versus Thomas Hose was ready to be heard. He entered the courtroom wearing a plain gray suit that hung loosely on his frame, his hair thinner, his shoulders slumped. The same man who once patrolled the hallways of Cornell Middle School with the authority of an adult trusted by parents now sat behind a wooden barrier, silent and expressionless. Across the room, in the first row of benches, sat Larry Catch. He had been told he didn't need to attend the early sessions, but he came anyway. For 10 years, he had lived with questions. Now he intended to hear the answers, even if they hurt. The charges against Jose filled nearly 2 pages. Involuntary deviant sexual intercourse, statutory sexual assault, aggravated indecent assault, interference with custody of a child, corruption of a minor, and endangering the welfare of a child. The word kidnapping was not among them, and though many in the courtroom found that absence hard to accept, the prosecution explained quietly what the evidence had shown, that he hadn't forced her into a car or dragged her away, but rather manipulated and entrapped her until she believed she could never return home. It didn't lessen the cruelty. It only defined it. Prosecutor Elaine Mason stood before the jury and spoke with deliberate calm. "He built his prison inside a child's mind," she said. "He didn't need bars or chains. He convinced her that she was forgotten, that her father no longer wanted her. That is how he kept her." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Each word fell like a small weight in the silence. Tanya, then 25, did not attend the early hearings. She gave her statement through her attorney and a counselor. The courtroom read her words in her absence. "I was 14 when he told me I could trust him. I believed him because adults are supposed to protect children. For years, I thought the world outside his door was gone. I lived in a small room with one lamp, and I forgot what sunlight looked like. I forgot my own name." When the letter was read aloud, several jurors lowered their eyes. Even the defense attorney paused before continuing. Jose sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the floor, his hands clasped tightly together. He spoke only once during the entire proceeding, in a low voice, to acknowledge that he understood the charges. The evidence was irrefutable. The upstairs room, the locked door, the testimony of neighbors who now realized the young girlfriend they'd seen was the missing girl from a decade before. It all painted a picture too clear to deny. The defense attempted to frame his actions as a tragic relationship built on poor judgment. The courtroom murmured in disbelief. The judge stopped the proceedings briefly to remind everyone that emotion could not outweigh law. But the words themselves hung heavy in the air. In early October 2007, Jose changed his plea to guilty. There would be no lengthy trial, no televised testimony. Perhaps he understood that the evidence would crush him, or perhaps, in his own twisted reasoning, he believed confession would preserve some dignity. The judge accepted the plea and prepared for sentencing. That morning, the courthouse was full. Reporters, locals, former students who still remembered him as the school guard. They all gathered, filling every row. When Larry entered, a hush followed. He looked older than the man who had once stapled missing posters to telephone poles, but his posture was straight. He wasn't there for revenge. He was there to witness the moment his daughter's name was restored from missing to found. When Tanya entered a few minutes later, escorted by her counselor, the entire room stood. She wore a simple blue blouse and carried a folded piece of paper in her hand. It was the statement she had written herself. The judge invited her to speak if she wished. She hesitated, then stepped forward. Her voice was soft, almost fragile, but every word carried. "I spent 10 years being told I didn't exist," she said, "that no one remembered me, that no one wanted me, but my father did. He never stopped believing. And now I'm here because one person, just one, looked at me and saw something familiar." She turned her head slightly toward Jose, but did not meet his eyes. "You told me the world outside was dangerous, but it wasn't. You were." For a long moment after she finished, the courtroom stayed silent. The judge nodded solemnly, then delivered the sentence. "The court finds the defendant guilty on all counts. He is hereby sentenced to serve a maximum of 15 years in state prison. Upon release, he is required to register as a lifetime sex offender under Pennsylvania law." 15 years. Some thought it too short. Others said no sentence could measure 10 years of captivity. Larry didn't comment. When reporters asked him later what he felt, he answered simply, "She's home. That's the only sentence that matters to me." Outside the courthouse, the crowd watched as Tanya stepped into the cold autumn light. The sky above McKeesport was overcast, the kind of gray that blurs the horizon. Flashbulbs went off, but she didn't flinch. She just stood for a moment, breathing deeply, the air of her hometown filling her lungs again. The world she'd been told no longer existed was right there in front of her, imperfect, noisy, alive. In the months that followed, Tanya began to rebuild her life. The road back was not easy. Years of isolation had left her wary of people, uncertain of where she belonged. But she found small comforts: the sound of the radio in the kitchen again, the walk to the grocery store without fear, the laughter of children passing her on the street. She began to volunteer with organizations that supported missing children, sometimes speaking quietly about hope, other times just listening. If one parent doesn't give up, she told a reporter once, then one child might find their way home. Thomas Jose served the full 15-year sentence. He was released in 2022. His name entered permanently in the state's offender registry. By then, Tanya had moved to another town, working under her own name again, surrounded by people who treated her not as a headline, but as a survivor. She rarely spoke of him. When asked, she said, "He took my childhood, not my life." In McKeesport, the story of her return lived on, not in gossip, but in quiet reminders. Her photograph still hung on the wall of Joe Sparico's store, framed now beside a clipping of the newspaper article from the day she was found. Above it, a handwritten note read simply, "Never stop looking." Justice had come and gone. The courtroom was empty, the reporters had moved on. But in that small town by the river, the light on Walnut Street still burned each evening. Not as a beacon this time, but as a promise that some lights, once lit, never go out. If this story moved you, if you believe that hope and truth still matter in a world that often forgets, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us bring more real stories like Tanya's to light. Tell us where you're watching from, and if you've ever known a story like this in your own town. Sometimes, the next person found begins with one person who's still